right. Good news, everybody. We got an interesting interview from Morgan Day and Ian Hazzikostas presented by Wowhead, and it states more significant affix changes coming. Wowhead interview with Morgan Day and Ian Hazzikostas. So Wowhead recently had the opportunity to sit down with Morgan Day and Ian to discuss many topics in the world within. In the segment, Morgan Day and Ian discuss some of the overarching philosophies and changes to M+ design coming in the world within. First and foremost, covering affixes. You know, affixes have continued to be a controversial topic amongst the community, especially after last week's announcements, which we talked about. I mean, I made a few different videos. There were different reactions of the community commenting on the fact that bolstering and sanguine remained. And so then we were given the opportunity to discuss these affixes with Morgan Day and Ian Hazzikostas. We gave them some time to discuss the overarching philosophies about affixes and M+. And this was actually really interesting because I think that a lot of players were not happy with the fact that bolstering and sanguine and raging and bursting were coming back, on top of the fact that, you know, maybe the Kiss Curse affixes weren't exactly what people were hoping for. Now, you know, I think that it's one of those things that if you compare affixes from the start of M+ ever, if you compare bolstering from Legion to bolstering now, there's a complete chasm of difference. But let's hear what Ian and Morgan have to say. Ian says this has obviously been a huge topic in the community in the most recent weeks, and it's been a huge topic within the WoW team for the most recent weeks. We're far from done whenever it comes to the current state of beta, and we're actually looking to roll out a couple more significant swings in how we approach affixes in the M+ system. As testing continues in the next coming weeks, and I don't want to get ahead in spoiling these things that we will see, but stay tuned for some forum and blog updates in the next coming beta builds. Thank God. This is very good. I'm super stoked for this. Morgan also mentions that some of the reasons they picked the affixes in level 7 bucket from last week's announcements, mentioning that they didn't want any additional adds or mechanics that could occur, no additional nameplates, no volcanic or sanguine that could occur. And if you watch my most recent video, I kind of talked about the same thing. You know, it really did simplify what was going on. But basically, Morgan says to speak to the post that we made, I think one of the major design goals that we could try to reiterate on is that we were trying to not create new nameplates in the gaming space. We're not trying to create new things that might be considered an ability mechanic on a boss fight. That obviously it creates like weird overlaps. You're not spawning a new ad. There's no quicking or volcanic where these mechanics that just kind of happen. Instead, they were obviously looking for something that's meant more passive. The things we wanted to focus on were the things that felt more like overarching rule changes, like all trash in the dungeons behave a certain way, and then you react in this way. But then they also mentioned there's going to be a couple more significant swings for affixes in the M+ system. And I think that, you know, taking a step back and actually looking at what the affixes are doing to players, I think is really good. And like I said, I think that I think they're close with the Kiss Curse affixes and the affix system as a whole. And I think that's really good. In addition to that, I think that there's a larger discrepancy between weekly keys and key pushing, which I think you've actually seen it be more and more spread over time, where weekly key doers are very, very separate with their needs than people who are actively pushing keys. For people who are pushing keys, you're basically pushing keys for the glory. And frankly, I've never felt like a 1% or more than whenever I talk about bursting, where for the average player, bursting is actually a pretty challenging affix. But for players like me, that's like a push week, right? Because that's a not time loss, and your healer is going to be able to appropriately deal with bursting. And so I'm interested in seeing what they're actually having to do with weekly keys versus key pushing. They continue to expand on some of their philosophies regarding affixes in general, noting that the primary purpose of affixes is not to add difficulty, but to add variety. For the average M+ player that wants to get some loot or fill out their vault, Ian explains that they're seeing consistent participation and success rates week over week, and believe that for this audience, affixes serve a valuable purpose in providing variety. And I would tend to agree. I think that the rotating dungeons and the variety that you're actually seeing in the affixes is really good for average players who are, you know, just trying to go through and, you know, do the dungeons or like see the dungeons. But for high-end players, it's going to be a much different experience. They also mentioned the other type of player, the players that like to push keys at the highest end of the system, whether that be for the title or just to improve their own personal best. For many years, these players have been identified and valued a quote-unquote push week, which is a week that has the most favorable affixes, and that would allow players to do the highest keys possible. Other weeks with less favorable affixes just make the entire season feel dead. They'll end up mentioning the affixes that impact these groups of players differently, with affixes like storming or bursting being considered free for high-end players, but having actually a very significant impact on lowering keystone success rate compared to that like bolstering and raging for average players. And so again, this is one of those things that there was just like a massive difference between people who are pushing keys, very skilled players versus an average players. And then they believe that it comes down that these groups of players, they believe that comes down to how these groups play. With the high-end group, they'll likely be looking to push things to the limit and try to pull as many groups as possible together. And Affix is having different effects and playstyles, so there needs to be a solution. I don't think the right answer is to remove affixes for all players. Actually, I think the term all players here is kind of interesting. It kind of implies that maybe affixes are going to be going away for high-end players. I could potentially see a level where affixes go away with this wording for me in Hazzikostas, where it's like all players. Like, what does this necessarily mean? Like, is like a 15 a level where you're no longer able to get rewards, you're no longer getting portals, and then it's like you're just pushing for glory, right? Like, would a 15 be like a correct level where you're no longer getting these rewards, and instead there's no affixes on the keys, and you're just actually pushing the system to the limit to try to play for whatever? Because personally, I've never played for gear. I only ever play for the glory of the score, right? Trying to get title, trying to do whatever. And so, yeah. It also seems that they understand the problem that high key pushers face here and have identified that there are two distinct groups of players that have different goals and interact with affixes differently. I agree with this. You have people who are doing weekly keys that want some variety week to week, and high key pushers that find the variation frustrating from week to week, and it looks like they're planning to make some big changes to address this. I don't think the right answer is to remove affixes for all players. However, we are discussing some solutions that may allow players who are focused on the competition, optimization, and perfection aspects of the dungeon system to have less randomness and variation over their week-to-week experience. What I will say in terms of feedback also is I think the key re-rolling system should maybe be addressed for especially like high-end key pushers. I do understand that. I think that Blizzard's very hesitant because they saw in BFA everybody only ran freehold for the entire expansion, same with Maw of Souls. And so I don't think they want players to have unlimited access to the keys that they want. But I do think like the key re-rolling system, especially if they're looking to try to accommodate high-end players, I think that's something in addition to these affixes, like a change to the key re-rolling system would be a welcome change. They also don't mention what these changes are. They said that they should be coming out in a blog post in the next week or two. Please like and subscribe to this video if you want to see more content. I'm probably going to cover this the moment it comes out. So yeah, they're also going to be really focused on separating goals and frustrations regarding affixes amongst these two groups of players. Because again, it's just one of the systems that it's really hard to serve the entire community in the correct way possible. And while things that I have needs for as somebody who's a high-end player, average players aren't going to have those same needs, right? Or they're not going to see the same part of the system that I'm necessarily seeing because, it's just like a very difference in perspective and it's a difference in play. We're also looking at this from the point of M+, trying to serve multiple audiences, trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution that's caused some problems in finding the correct solution. And so I think that, having this gradual change over the course of the entire dungeon makes sense. And I think that this also stands true for mechanics. Like if you look at boss mechanics, Tyrannical and Fortified is very polarizing for players. Where high-end players have the hardest time with Tyrannical because they design bosses that have phases that are based around time, where your average player is never going to get more than 1 or 2 phases. A high-end player might get 3 or 4, and that is just like a very different experience. On the beta, we had one Fortified and Tyrannical to be added at the level 2, while the other one was added at level 10. I think most people thought this was a bug, but this would, in theory, make less variation, allow Blizzard to more easily tune high-end key pushing experience, since it has less variation. In a similar fashion, they could reduce or remove the affix rotation in high keys, which would address the concerns that I mentioned above. I think this is just a bug. I think it's a bug that's left over from the last expansion. So I mean, you could just remove Tyrannical and Fortified, which definitely homogenizes the weeks a bit more. I don't think it would happen at +10, I guess is maybe my immediate reaction. The stop meta. In previous expansions before Dragonflight, when a player used stuns or displacement abilities on mobs that were casting, it would likely just start to cast the ability again whenever the CC effect was over. The only way to truly stop the cast was to use an interrupt like Counterspell. However, in Dragonflight, a decision was made to make most, if not all, mobs not recast their ability, which I think that this was really good, if they were CC out of their cast. It had some interesting impacts on the meta, as most interrupts weren't handled by proper interrupts, but now by stops, and notably AoE CC abilities. Y coordinates single target interrupts or stuns when an AoE CC ability can do it. This change had an impact on what classes were desired. We asked Ian and Morgan about the prevalence of stops in Dragonflights, if there was any plans to address them. I'll just tackle this from my perspective first. I think that there is an arms race and a power creep issue with 1 defensives, but 2 AoE stops. In the past, if you look at, like, historically, Rogue was this single target stop specialist, right? Where they would have a million AoE stops. And I was talking with my friend Nerda a few weeks back, and he was talking about how everybody feels like they're now a Rogue. And I actually, the more that I thought about it, I actually think that he was absolutely right. Pretty much every single class has a ton of single target stops. And in the past, too, like, Druid was the king of the AoE stop. Druid and Monk had the most AoE stops in the game by a mile. Now everybody has a bunch of AoE stops and feels like a Druid or a Monk, where they have 2, 3, 4 AoE stops. Now, like, Aug Evoker has, Tail Swipe, Wing Buffet, Upheaval Knockup. They can Sleepwalk. They can, Breath of Eon Stun. Everybody feels like they have, 4 or 5 stops for a trash pack. And I think that this, there's definitely been an arms race for Blizzard's design philosophies on how they're designing trash mobs, how many stops, how many kicks, how many just mechanics are into trash mobs in Mythic Plus. But this has to happen because, kind of similar to the defensive problem, where that's the only way to really challenge players is if you add a bunch of stops. Well, so let's read what Ian said. The team has started designing specific abilities and dungeons to go on cooldown whenever the spell cast began, no matter what. So that if you stop the cast in any manner, whether it was death gripping the mob or CCing it, it would go on cooldown as if it's just been interrupted. This is still appropriate in some circumstances, but the increasing proliferation in dungeons is what kind of created this incredibly powerful utility that's been seen to dictate perceived optimal comps in the past few years. So we've been designing War Within Dungeons to move back closer on how things used to be in that regard. Still doing it where it's appropriate, but not defaulting to have abilities go on cooldown when the cast starts. These tools should still be tremendously powerful tools for disrupting and for managing and for relocating enemies in dungeon, but they shouldn't be the answer to nearly every problem that you're presented in a way that reduces viable comp diversity. I think that there's a large knowledge barrier in M+ in general, and if you have mobs that aren't uniform, where stops don't act the same as interrupts, I think that comes off a bit weird, especially if you're trying to learn how the mobs work fully. And I think it allowed for players a little bit easier of a time whenever you knew that a stop was going to work the same as an interrupt. I think it allows, players that are trying to jump into M+ a bit of an easier time. I do think that it's in terms of mechanics. I think that we're just in a power creep issue. I think that's my personal opinion, is just too many classes have too many stops, too many classes have too many defensives. We should start really tuning that back. I think that would be a big starting point. Seems like the goal is to pull back on some of the impact of some of the stops in M+ by making mobs recast their abilities. This does seem to add an additional burden of knowledge on the player. Yeah, I agree with this. Having to learn and remember what can and cannot be stopped, but it seems better than the alternative, a hyper focus on AoE CC abilities. Is that even true though? I mean, dude, everybody has so many stops. I'm this player in Mythic Plus where I'm calling everybody's AoE stop. Me and a tank are basically calling 100% of the AoE stops that are in a dungeon, and it's I don't think that's gonna go away. But I don't know. I think that we really needed to start reining back on how many stops players have too, whenever this is also designed in terms of a design philosophy. And then you can simplify trash, because if everybody doesn't have 6 stops, it's like the XQC meme. It's 3 consoles, 7 monitors, a gaming PC, 6 streaming PCs. It's you look at Evoker's toolkit, and it's 2 displacements, 3 knockups, 1 AoE stun, 1 sap, and it's dude, if every class isn't like that, if every class is just a bit more normal, then maybe we wouldn't have this problem. Morgan Day then goes on to explain that in doing this, it won't be in just a vacuum, that they'll be taking a look at things like cast times, recast times, and how dangerous they are, and they can also make further adjustments there. I mean, I agree with this. I mean, that's the nuance of it all, is that it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution. There's a lot of nuance that happens in this. Full answers. These answers are transcribed from Morgan and Hazzikostas, and they got edited for brevity. Let's see. Affixes have continued to be a controversial topic. Okay, so the TLDR, I think that these are all pretty positive things that Blizzard is stating. I think that every single point they actually are trying to cater to the community in the best possible way, and they understand that they couldn't cater to both high-end players and casual players simultaneously, so they're maybe trying to separate out the two, where there is this path if you want to start pushing keys, but if you're really not into it, you don't have to. Okay, so let's see. Affixes continue to be the controversial topic at this point. It seems like the closer that we get to an affix that does nothing, the happier people are. Do you still think affixes are needed? Okay, now for people who are playing Mythic Plus at the high end of the system, people have long since gotten Keystone Hero and their teleports and are pushing potentially for the season titles or to just improve their personal best. The only thing that they're playing for in the system is raising that bar. And so at the cutting edge limits of the system, whenever you have variation from week to week, there will be some outcomes that are more favorable for some than others. For groups that are pushing their limits, that they realize that they're able to achieve a new best push week on bursting or whatever. I don't think the right answer is to move affixes for all players. Again, I think that this maybe means that affixes might be going away for high-end players. That would be kind of interesting. At like a plus 15, like once you're able to do it that high, you no longer have affixes and you're purely playing the dungeon. That would be insane. This is something that we've seen across dungeons over other forms in the expansion, going back to past expansions. Dungeon like Archway or Waycrest Manor used to have different routes from week to week, or even from run to run in some cases, to vary the experience. So it feels like players running the dungeon, you're exploring a dynamic environment. But we understand that if you're in an esports setting or trying to absolutely squeeze out every ounce of performance, your group can have variation is unwelcome. Yeah. I think that's interesting. I will say that the only downside of actually having affixless keys past a certain level is then it kind of creates a situation where you're like, you'll play like every single week, but you're not necessarily. I think it's kind of fun whenever the community kind of gets together and plays like very specific weeks. I think that can be fun, as opposed to feeling obligated or wanting to play every single week. But I do think that I think that Blizzard's actually doing the right thing here. I think that this is going to be a sick system. I think the fact that they're identifying this as a potential problem and seeing this group of players, like, dude, my group of players as like an underserved group in this regard. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about, baby. We're back. The community reacted seeing bolstering and sanguine and still the rotation. These affixes seem to go against the mantra of minimizing mechanical overlap between affixes and dungeon trash design. I actually think that Blizzard thinks that this is probably lowering the mechanical overlap between affixes and dungeon trash design, because they viewed like volcanic and they viewed things like volcanic and spiteful and stuff like that as not a part of the dungeon, where they view like bolstering and sanguine as like these are things that are based off of like killing mobs. And I think they viewed on death affixes a little bit differently than because they saw like volcanic and storming as like not a part of the default dungeon, whereas like killing on death mobs I think is a little bit different. Let's see what Morgan has to say. The changes that we're discussing right now are pretty big swings. We're looking at this from the point of Mim Plus is trying to serve multiple audiences. We're taking a step back there. What are the affixes? What are they trying to achieve week over week for the audience that is less looking to push rating and be extremely competitive? What is excitement that you actually feel whenever you have this new affix introduced week over week? To speak to the post that we have made, one of the major design goals that we could try to reiterate on is more that we are trying to not create new nameplates in the gameplay space. We're not trying to create things that might be considered a mechanic on a boss fight. Yeah, and it's kind of what we're talking about earlier. But like we said, we're taking a big step back and revisiting all that with our next iteration. Dude, I feel like this interview, they actually just said the right thing at every single point of time. They've been given the opportunity to actually kind of shut down and be like, yeah, maybe this is something that we'll look at in the future, but instead they're actually really taking it by the horns and being like, you know what? If this is actually what players want, we're going to be willing to give it to them. Ian also states in regards to affixes, we're actually looking at data to inform our decisions. There are meaningful differences in how people experiences the content based on the level that they're running at. Affix like Storming, that was considered a free affix by very high-end players, had a noticeable impact on the success rate at lower ranges. I'm not surprised. Something like Bursting, again, is considered far easier than Bolstering or Raging. Dude, I cannot reiterate this enough. This is actually spot on. He's actually so correct about this. I've never felt so disconnected from the M Plus community than whenever I created a video talking about Push Week and it was a Bursting Week, and pretty much everybody in the comment section was like, how is this a Push Week? Bursting sucks. Whereas for high-end players are fine with Bursting, and Bursting is actually very, very easy because at some point, your healer becomes good, your DPS stop taking damage, and you start actually pressing defensives against Bursting. But that doesn't happen until like you actually start reaching a high-end level, right? But for average players who are taking Bursting unmitigated, also standing in avoidable mechanics and stuff like that, Bursting is a much, much different experience. Also, the strategies being used are different because, dude, I'm not pulling one pack at a time. I'm pulling 2 or 3 packs at a time because I'm trying to time the key. Whereas, like, if you're pulling one pack at a time, I'm sure Raging is fine. I'm sure Bolstering is fine because you're never going to run into a problem. Because, like, the packs are fine if you're pulling one pack at a time. But I think that like every group of players should be catered to. You know, I think that the fact that they're kind of trying to separate out the high end from the casuals is like a good part of the system. Players who are playing at a different level, at a different meta, using different approaches in the dungeon are having totally different experiences. So that's a lot of what we're trying to navigate as we think through how to evolve M+ going forwards. Yes! Yes! This is what I'm talking about! Yes! Okay, so this is the thing about stops. Also creates a disparity between how the game works and how M+ dungeons works in some cases. Spells only have a cooldown when they're kicked or complete their cast, and that's my expectations as a player. That's how my player works. As Ian mentioned, taking a step back and essentially reevaluating and treating that as a different experience from how the game works to provide an opportunity for us to look at and evaluate other things. We don't want to just make this change in a vacuum. There must stop. What's the recast time? Okay. Yeah, I think that, I think that makes sense. Again, I think that this is more of an arms race on defensives and power creep and like utility creep than anything else. All right. Question: do you think they'll ever get to the point of lobbing Fort and Tyran? I think that that's probably the minimum thing that they would do here, is actually lobbing Fort and Tyran. I think that Fort and Tyran is something that high-end players actually have a very different experience than like an average player. For like average players, they, funnily enough, average players actually find Tyran easier because the trash just gets completely exploded, and so it's kind of hard to wipe. In general, I think that I actually feel very heard whenever I read this post. It's kind of unfortunate that they didn't talk about defensive creep, I think that, but in general, these are the things that I would identify as major problems or things that my group of players, like people who push high-end keys, identify as problems. And I've actually never felt more heard than this post. I'm super stoked to see actually what they come up with in the blue post in the next few weeks. But I think that everything they stated in this post is very positive. I'm super excited to see what they come up with. Allegedly, there's supposed to be another post today from Wowhead. I'm probably going to release 2 YouTube videos today, so, stay tuned for that kind of thing. I'll be back later, probably recording another YouTube video. So yeah, if you like this kind of content, like, subscribe. Yeah. Goodbye.